a little difficult for me to put my finger on the pulse as to what's been happening lately in the gaming sphere. Because we know there's been a lot of really insane changes ever since the Switch generation started, and I've pointed out a lot of this, right? I've said how the narrative that Nintendo is going bankrupt has gone into the ground and is about to be buried, right? I've explained how like Zelda has become, eclipsed the popularity of Final Fantasy. Like people are turning on the third parties who refuse to support Nintendo hardware, right? Major established franchises like Mortal Kombat, Street Fighter, Tekken, Guilty Gear, like all of them are falling off, and like all of them have like very low player counts and are not remaining relevant in any way, shape, or form. Nintendo is dominating in genres that they traditionally have not done very well in, like fighting and RPGs, and it has been the times are changing essentially to the point where like I honestly don't expect Xbox and PlayStation to be viable competitors going forward, right? I think there's going to be a last stand of relevancy with Grand Theft Auto 6, which is going to win a bunch of awards and sell a bunch of units and be like the most talked about game for the foreseeable future, but the next Nintendo's game is going to come out and the next, and the next, and the next. And then eventually, Grand Theft Auto 6 will not be a new game anymore. That's my estimation, is that, like, Grand Theft Auto 6 is going to underwhelm a lot of people. It's not going to impress, and players are going to gradually just find more of an interest in what Nintendo is pointing out. This has been what's happening for the past decade. Grand Theft Auto 5 sold 100 million units, but people bought Mario Kart 8 Deluxe. People bought Animal Crossing New Horizons. They bought Splatoon 3. They bought Xenoblade Chronicles 2. They bought Fire Emblem Three Houses and ARMS and Octopath Traveler and a Penny's Big Breakaway and all this other amazing stuff on Nintendo Switch, right? Grand Theft Auto is one video game franchise, and it absolutely cannot carry PlayStation and Xbox through another console generation. That is the reality of what we're seeing here now. And what this means is that people have no business playing on PlayStation and Xbox. People have been migrating over to Nintendo consoles, right? They have slowly been discovering just the vast lineup of like great Nintendo exclusives, and the old like claim that you only buy a Nintendo console for Nintendo games. It's or that like Nintendo is kiddie or whatever, like all of that is kind of blowing up in their faces, right? Because Nintendo has a vast lineup of games far superior than the entire rest of the industry combined, right? The people who grew up on video games have kids of their own now, so of course they want the kiddie console, and now you have like an entire generation of people who grew up on this stuff, who have an appreciation for Mario, Zelda, Pokemon, Fire Emblem, Metroid, Kirby, like the list goes on. Like you do not see people aggressively come after you for liking Nintendo the way that they did like 10, 15, 20 years ago, right? It just does not happen in the same capacity. Has it disappeared entirely? No, of course not. But it is a dying mindset, and it has been for a long time. And I was sitting here thinking about this because I've always said that like this was inevitable. This was always going to happen, right? Right. The software was too good for the narrative to continue indefinitely. But why now? What has changed over the past several years that has caused so many people to suddenly be openly advocating for Nintendo? Right? What has changed in the culture that has allowed like pro Nintendo sentiments to blossom, right? Of course the Switch did well and that was a major part of it, but I think a bigger issue, and this really does need to be talked about, is that the games that the industry is putting forward as like the anti-Nintendo masterpieces, the games that are supposed to be the new Final Fantasy VIIs and the Metal Gear Solids, right? Console sellers, these are not exciting people like they used to. In the 90s, you would get Final Fantasy VII and this massive adventure spanning multiple discs with all this crazy music and FMV video, like FMV cutscenes, and just, like an amazing story with memorable characters, right? You can argue Final Fantasy VII is not as good as like the Super Nintendo RPGs. It's not. But at the same time, like there's definitely an appeal to it. There's definitely like, something there. It's absolutely a must-play game, right? Same with Metal Gear Solid. It's not as good as what Nintendo was doing, but for a company that's like, putting out games on PlayStation, it's pretty reasonably good. Okay. Like, again, people liked these games for what they were. They had appreciation for them. They were fun, they were intuitive, they were inventive. There wasn't really anything else like them on Nintendo hardware. They were distinguishable enough that people could get a lot of value and enjoyment out of them. Even if there were better things out there on Nintendo consoles. When you compare that with today, when you compare that with the Elden dingalings, when you compare that to the Baldur's Gate 3s, like when you compare that to like the It Takes Twos of the world, like you really get this sense that mainstream audiences are not interested in what game journos are trying to sell you, right? People bought into The Last of Us, like part one being like the greatest cinematic like story in video game history, but like by the time part two rolled around, people started seeing through it. They began asking really good questions, like, wait a minute, is this not just a generic zombie movie? No, it's not just that. It's a video game, but all you're doing is walking forward and listening to characters talk. Like, no, it's so deep and compelling. Like, oh, our protagonist is gay. Oh man, isn't that deep? Isn't that profound? That they should give us an Oscar for this video game. It's like, oh man, I bet when the game director Neil Druckmann shows up at the Golden Globes, everybody's gonna want to take his picture. Like, as if that's gonna happen. But like, yeah, like again, Game Journos were still doing their thing where they were hyping up mid products like The Last of Us, like Elden Ring, like Baldur's Gate 3, and they simply don't have a mass appeal. Like you can brag all you want about like, oh, Baldur's Gate 3 won a Game of the Year award from Jeff Keighley. Well, okay, but do people go out and buy games based on Jeff Keighley's recommendation? Like, do they look at Baldur's Gate 3 and tell themselves like, oh, I want to get fucked by the bear? Like, do they look at like the general gameplay and the visuals of Baldur's Gate 3 and like tell themselves that looks appealing to them? No. Like, generally speaking, gamers are playing games that they actually enjoy. D&D is a niche thing. It is not mainstream. It is not that big of a deal. People will not buy a video game on the idea that like, oh, it's like D&D. Like, we have better alternatives in Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest. D&D is not special in the world of video games, right? So like this idea that Baldur's Gate 3 is some like monumental masterpiece just kind of falls apart when you like look at the sheer amount of people who were like mentioning the fact that like I did not know this game was turn-based. If I had known that, I would not have bought it, right? Doesn't that like speak volumes as like the kind of people who have just went into Baldur's Gate 3, expecting like something playable only to get something that like in a genre that they didn't expect. Like again, the journos did a bad job explaining what the game actually was. No, not intentionally misleading to like lure in as many normies as possible into playing this mediocre RPG to get them to hype it up. And people bought the game, they played it for maybe like 30 minutes and were just like, "Oh, this is boring." And then like shut it off and returned it, right? Same with Elden Ring. People bought Elden Ring expecting like this deep dark like story written by George R. R. Martin, and what do? You wander around an empty field for like 10 hours trying to figure out where to go. You can't even level up right away. Like I can't imagine that the average person got past like Margit, right? I did get past Margit, by the way. But the game just isn't good, right? These games are simply not appealing to a mainstream audience. And this is why they did not deserve any kind of mainstream awards or recognition because mainstream audiences, casuals, are rejecting them. The same people who are like putting dozens of hours into Zelda and Mario are not really getting into these supposed Game of the Year winners. And that is leading to a culture where the games that the game journals are talking about, the games that they're hyping up, the games that they want you to play are games that nobody plays, that nobody talks about, that nobody cares about. And if anything, if my circle is indication, like the games that people are talking about and playing are games that game journals never talk about, right? Like nobody is hyped for like MEO, the Famicom Detective Club right now, right? And again, it's going to be something that I really play and enjoy and talk about, right? Like it's remarkable how this seems to like consistently happen with every major release, right? We saw this last year with like games like Cereza and the Lost Demon and like Grim Grimoire came out that year, I think. We got like all this crazy stuff in 2023. Like we saw game journals like bend over backwards, trying to damage control Tears of the Kingdom, trying to damage control Super Mario Bros. Wonder, and it didn't work. But the mere fact that they tried what is enough reason to kind of hold them in contempt and kind of like expose them for what they're trying to do. Like, this has been true for a long time, but like these people are deliberately ignoring the games that people actually like and enjoy. I had to deal with people like downplaying massive, huge success stories like Nintendo Switch Sports, right? I have to deal with people just incessantly trying to convince you that like every new Mario and Zelda game is bad, right? I have to deal with people like trying to say that like Nintendo ruined Metroid in the 90s or something, or that Pokemon is falling off, when none of that is really true at all. It is just a cope to keep a discussion of Nintendo negative. That is what all of this boils down to. And I do think the general public is reaching the point where they are almost ready to call this out for what it is.